Awesome.
Okay, hey everyone. So just a quick intro to anyone new to the group. This is the Trends in NeuroAI reading group, which is part of the medARC NeuroAI lab. We're a lab that collaborates with Stability AI, Princeton, other institutions to do open source NeuroAI research. And so we do work with volunteers. If anyone is interested in working together, we have our Discord server. You can go to medarc.ai/fMRI. And for the sake of this presentation, feel free to interrupt with questions. You can use your mic or you can use the Zoom chat, and then I can speak on your behalf. So for this, we have Dr. Nick Blouch, who is a postdoc at Harvard working in the Conkle and Alvarez labs, working on how to make computational models that learn to see more like humans. We'll be learning about their topographic transformer modeling paper. We're also joined by the first and middle authors of the paper, Taha Bin Harab and Greta Takut, who can help with discussion, answering questions. And yeah, very grateful to have you here. And Nick, you can go ahead.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction. Really looking forward to this chat, and I think that what you guys are doing with this community is really exciting, and I'm eager to learn more about this sort of open source science community, and glad to get to participate in it a bit. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to tell you about these topographic transformer models that we've developed along with Taha and Greta. So the basic motivation for this work sort of, for me, started from the visual system. So we know from decades of research, including a lot of fMRI research, that there's this topographic organization of the ventral temporal or inferotemporal cortex, where you see things like different categories activating different clusters of the cortical surface, and they appear in sort of consistent locations across subjects. So you can see a typical subject will have face selectivity in a few different regions. It'll have scene selectivity in this more medial region, word selectivity that's going to be a little bit more dominant in the left hemisphere, and so on. You can find clusters for lots of different categories that have this topographic contiguity to them. But also, it's not just about these category clusters. There are also properties that encompass different categories that sort of span even more of the same brain area. So we know that these category selective areas fall within preference zones for things like animacy and real-world size. So that's some work from Talia Conkle. And these dimensions might also be described in terms of object space, like more generic object space features that you can derive from a convolutional neural network, and sort of the animacy and real-world size somewhat falls out of that. And we also know that if you just really like zone in on neurons, like, and you use electrophysiological techniques, and you measure the tuning of different neurons to different images, the correlation of that tuning across pairs of neurons decays simply with distance. So that might be sort of a simple explanation for some of these different topographic properties. If you have tuning similarity that decays with distance, you might end up representing the relevant features topographically. So recently, there's kind of been an explosion of research in computational neuroscience trying to model some of this topographic organization. I've been involved with some of it. We developed something called the Interactive Topographic Network, which basically models this organization as emerging from a combined task objective and a wiring cost minimization objective, where we're explicitly minimizing wiring cost. And in so doing that, while trying to learn good features that represent tasks, you end up learning a topographic organization. You end up getting this distance-dependent response correlation, and really the information for different domains is represented. So in this figure here, you can see a searchlight map for information for decoding between different faces. You can see it clusters along with the red part here, which is the face selective area. There was somewhat earlier and also now later work on a similar model called the Topographic Deep Artificial Neural Network that really just models this local correlation. So they just enforce local correlation, and that works really nicely to give you topography as well. We found that local correlation emerged from the wiring cost, so they seem to kind of be related. And then there's been some cool work with self-organizing maps, which is a classic model that seems to work for explaining ventral temporal cortex as well. And then recently also work with variational autoencoders by Andy Keller. So you can see there's a proliferation of these sort of models that all explain the topography in relatively similar principles. Local wiring costs, good representations that support tasks, local correlation. There's a lot of relationships between here, and I think we're kind of due for a review on all these different models, but these are the basic ideas. So we wanted to know whether these principles might extend beyond vision. Locally biased connectivity is not something that is restricted to high-level vision. It's really ubiquitous in the brain. So we wanted to know, does this shape topographic organization of other systems in the brain? And of course, we know early visual cortex also can be modeled according to the same principles. This was done like 30 years ago when we didn't need convolutional neural networks to make, progress. You can just model simple orientation tuning preferences and show that the patterns of pinwheels in V1 emerges from those types of constraints. But we also know like the whole brain is topographically organized. So there's been this beautiful work by Alex Huth and colleagues showing these semantic maps that tile the brain. And then lots of work with functional connectivity. If you look at the patterns of distributed functional connectivity with different seeds, you can see that those patterns are topographically organized. So this red seed, corresponds to this pattern of functional correlation. This green seed corresponds to this green pattern of functional correlation, and so on. You can see it's not necessarily local, but it is topographically organized with a few local patches. Recently, there was this great review focusing mostly on vision, but asking big questions by Arcaro and Livingstone. And one of their concluding questions was, are even higher cognitive functions such as language topographic? So we were excited to see this because we had already been working on this question. So we know that we've got sort of the tools to ask these questions for language. Recently, these transformer models have been doing really well at language tasks, and they've also now been used as state-of-the-art models of language processing. So they're doing the task well, they're predicting human behavior pretty well, and they're predicting brain data pretty well. So they seem to be good candidate models. And if we can just figure out how to get them to organize topographically, we might be able to make some progress in understanding the topographic representation of language. So this is where Taha came in and said, let's do a research project on this. So what do we know about the cortical representation of language? Well, we know that there is in basically every human subject, a network of brain regions that responds more to sentences than perceptually matched control conditions. So that can be strings of pronounceable non-words or degraded speech, lots of different things that are sort of similar to language in some sense, but don't have the same type of meaning that language has. And you get a pretty reliable language network, regardless of which contrast you use. Across subjects, the location of these regions, it's relatively consistent. So you'll see activation in these temporal regions and frontal regions, which can be broken down into subregions. And it's usually left dominant, especially in right-handed people, although in some left-handed individuals, you'll see more of a right dominance. It's distributed across both hemispheres with the left dominance in most subjects. But, just like most functional areas, there's enough variability in where this stuff happens that it's better to localize it in individual subjects than rely on an anatomical definition. So that's how it's typically done. You can also find this language network with resting state analyses. And typically this network is analyzed at the ROI or network level, and typically the topographic organization of the subregions is not really considered. So why might that be? Well, there's been some work that's looked at functional subdivisions within the language network, and it's been surprisingly a lot of null results. So one thing you might think would be represented differentially within these language regions is semantics or meaning versus syntax. And it turns out that's not the case. So if you look at all of these different anatomical parcels of the language network, they all really respond a lot to semantics. They all care more about semantics than syntax, and they're all sensitive to syntax as well. So that didn't really explain it very well. Comprehension and production, that's kind of another classic case where the frontal regions maybe would be more involved in production and the temporal regions would be more involved in comprehension. But when we're talking about the language regions, rather than other sort of like motor regions or auditory regions, these actually are all equally basically sensitive to comprehension and production. So they respond under both tasks. It's not a clean division across any of these parcels. And if you look at people who speak multiple languages, these different languages that they speak all activate basically the same network. So, these three reasonable hypotheses about what might be differentially represented across space in the language network have not been shown convincingly to be so. So we don't know much about the topographic representation of language. We know that there's this network, but we don't know much about sort of fine scale topographic differences. And just one more result is sort of in favor of this homogeneity view. Greta recently published a study, and this is the data set that we'll use when I move on a little bit, looking at basically which properties and which sentences drive activation in the language network the most. And she found that those sentences are highly correlated across all of these different regions. So all of these different language network regions seem to be driven by similar properties, at least at the level of the whole ROI. Okay. So just to summarize again, there's multiple regions involved in the processing of language. This forms an integrated functional network. They can't be, cleanly segregated into production and comprehension or syntax and semantics regions. And there's really no clear story about the fine-grained functional organization. So it's typically analyzed as a whole. So we thought that a data-driven approach, really focused on topographic organization might allow for novel insights. And so this is where Greta offered up her data, and we've been able to make some progress in understanding the topographic organization of these regions. So how do we do that? This data set contains 1,000 sentences in each of 5 subjects. So that's a pretty good size data set for being able to look at sort of a data-driven sense of organization. They're all short sentences, so 6 words, and it's a fast event-related fMRI design where the sentences are fully on the screen for 2 seconds, and then it's 4 seconds in between sentences. We use these probabilistic parcels. So basically, these are the probabilistic parcels that are derived from many subjects of where these language regions usually are. Then you look within each of those and find the voxels that are selective for language in an individual subject, and that's what you analyze as the language network. Because we wanted to have a good amount of space to actually find topographic variability, we used a more relaxed threshold for language selectivity than is typically used. Oftentimes, researchers will look at the top 10 most selective units. Here, we just said it needs to just be a little bit language selective, so we used a t-statistic threshold of 1. We used smoothing for the localization, but not for our analyses. So our analyses are using unsmoothed data so that we don't introduce, artificial topography through smoothing. Okay, so is everyone with me here for these initial brain analyses? It's a good time to ask questions, if not. Okay, cool. So first thing I'll do here is just show an example subject. This is what the language selectivity looks like within those probabilistic parcels. You can see this subject had pretty strong language selectivity in most of the probabilistic parcel. So that gives us a reasonable amount of space to look at further. And what I'll do is just do principal components analysis across this pattern of responses. So across all these selective voxels and all sentences, we'll just do PCA, and I'll show you what the weights of those components look like. So these are the weights onto the first principal component, second, third, and fourth. You can see that those weights under the different principal components reveal some of the topographic organization. It's not exactly clear what's going on, but you can see that the weights are smoothly organized, even though we didn't, do any artificial smoothing to the data. And in terms of the variance that these components explain, we found that the first component, which is basically strictly positive, explains a large amount of the variance, and the later principal components revealed sort of more fine-grained differentiation. So you'll see that they're made up of positive and negative weightings, and they explain much less variance than the first component, but still cumulatively a lot of variance. So it seems like there's some topographic variability, even if we're not able to label it yet. There seems to be something going on there. So just to show you, this is a general pattern. These are the other, here's 3 more subjects, and it's same story in each of them. That first component is always pretty much positive and explains the most variance. And then we get these finer grained differentiations within the other later components. Okay. So how can we quantify this? I'm just showing you these like pretty pictures, but it's not clear whether there's, is or is not something there. So we took this idea from this lead-all paper, which introduced the topographic deep artificial neural network, which is based on local correlation. And, they basically argued that local correlation is a hallmark of topography. So we took that seriously, and we developed a metric that we could use to quantify topography in terms of local correlation. And this doesn't require you to know anything about what's being represented, just have something that you can measure local correlation over. So we can come up with this statistic TG, which is just the correlation of the pairwise responses, the negative pairwise responses with distance. So you want this to fall off with distance. That's why you have the negative sign. So a high TG statistic would be large amount of topography or large amount of decay of response correlation. We can also characterize that at different scales, because maybe we've got local topography, but then it's kind of like flips and repeats. And we can summarize that topography over the different scales. So what this does is basically compute the statistic over a restricted distance, and then do that for many different distances. And then you can, summarize that with the average of those statistics, for example. So just to give you a sense of what this might look like, here's an example pairwise response correlation plot over, over distance for one of these language parcels in one subject. And you can see it does decay with distance. And this is the statistic value we get. We end up getting 0.218, and this is just computed over the full distance here. Okay. So we quantified this for all the regions and all of the subjects. This is over, this is the distance specific metric. You can see it's, the correlation is mostly quite local. So the statistic falls off when you consider a larger range of distances. If we just compute it over the full range, you can see the values here. They're not super high, anywhere from like 0.1 to 0.3. So not super high, but we did 2 control analyses to make sure this is significantly greater than chance. The first is on the top here, where we shuffled the voxel activities and computed the same statistic. This null distribution is very tightly centered on 0, so it's definitely greater than that. One other thing was, because we're doing this all in group space, we thought that transformation into group space might be introducing some smoothness. So we basically, in this second analysis, did shuffling before that group space transformation, computed the statistic again, and again, it's very tightly around 0. So in all cases, the topography was significantly greater than both of these null distributions for all subjects. So seemed to be something there. So to summarize,
can I interrupt with
yeah,
some
absolutely.
chat questions?
Yeah.
Is the response defined as the contrast between language and baseline?
The response here is, so we've got a localizer, which is like comparing sentences and some perceptually matched control. And then we have the main experiment, which is just different sentences. And so a response is basically an estimate of the signal corresponding to each sentence. So there's what's called a general linear model that's fit to the data, where each sentence gets its own regressor, and we get a beta weight corresponding to the contribution of that sentence to the bold signal in each voxel. So that's what the response is.
Okay, great. And thank you, Greta, for also answering in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah, happy to mention. So a great question Alex asked, are the suppressed sentences of Greta's data used in this analysis? And suppressed sentences are sentences that were, designed to try to lower the responses. And for the sake of this analysis, we did not include those, because you might see like weird bias by including these like model selected sentences. So this is just a full 1,000 sentence set that were extracted from corpora based on linguistic diversity.
Thanks, Greta. Okay, good to go? Okay, so I'm just presenting all this to try to convince you that there's something worth modeling here. So to summarize this, we found that each subject shows a dominant component of positive activation. Later components show topographic variability within and across regions. This local correlation is significant, even without smoothing, though it's kind of somewhat weak. So we wanted to know whether we can simulate this in a sentence computable model and use this model to drive greater understanding of what's going on in the language network. Okay.
Can I ask a quick question right here before we switch over?
Sure.
So like, I'm pretty tracking you that there's some internal topographic structure to the language network. But at this point, we don't really know what it is, right? We don't know if there's different areas, we don't know what they do. Do you have some hope that you'll be able to maybe generate some predictions about the internal topographic structure of the language network, maybe by inducing topography and then figuring out in the model case? Or
We do
what
have
are you
hope.
thinking?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's a hard problem, and I think this relates to the idea of superposition in large language models. There are so many features that are represented in the language, and probably many more features than we have units available to represent it, or at least voxels anyway, and at least model units in a given layer, that it seems like units are able to represent many features simultaneously. So I think that problem, like the problems of mechanistic interpretability, that people are using sparse autoencoders to try to, uncover these like particular features. I'm really like excited to try to use some of those to understand what's going on in the model and see if we can, I think it'll be harder to apply that to the brain, but I think there's some hope there. But I think it might be that might be the insight. It might be the insight that there is this topographic organization that can't quite be named. There'll be some things that can be named, like surprisal seems to explain a lot of variance. Imageability explains variance. Social content explains variance or stuff like this. But these components don't seem to map neatly onto any one of these labels. So these components, they map onto many of these labels. So it's hard to label the individual components. It's hard to label like this area does this and this other area does this. Rather, it's like there are these spatial constraints that seem to be giving rise to topographic organization of the responses, but there's sort of involvement of the whole network for any given property. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to understand that better. But it might be a sort of a different story than we're used to when we think about topography, and that might be why we haven't had a clean story of topography in language. It's just that it doesn't have the same notion of functional organization where this content is here and this other content is here. It might all be a little bit more intermixed, even if it's subject to the same constraints and the same sort of smoothness of responses.
Yeah, super interesting. Okay.
Cool. Thanks.
There was one more question in the chat.
What role does covariance play? I think we'll get to that in a second. So we'll get to the covariance when I try to compare the model and brain components. So I'm going to try to now get into describing the model a little bit, because I know that that's probably more what you guys are interested in than establishing topography in the language network, but it's all cool. But I think this might be a little bit more interesting. Okay, so self-attention. Probably most people here are at least roughly familiar with what self-attention is. It's the foundation of transformers. It's what gives them, it's one of the main things that gives them their power. And so we've got this formula here for self-attention where we've got some queries, which is just a projection of our embeddings from the previous layer. We've got our keys, which is our projection of the embeddings, and our values. All these are projections of the inputs. And then we do some stuff with those to, compute an output. So what we're doing here is we're taking a dot product or a matrix multiplication of the queries and the keys. We're normalizing it, we're scaling it by the values, and then we're reweighting it. So we want to figure out like, how can we make this topographic? So what we did here is, you can see here on the top, this is the standard equation here. So there's not going to be any topographic organization. This is basically maps for a single token here. So this is one thing I want to just clarify off the bat with our approach. All of this topographic organization that I'm talking about is for the features of a token. It's not about how the different tokens, it's not about constraints across tokens. It's about the feature space of a given token and how that feature space will communicate with other tokens, but it's not about which tokens get to communicate with which other tokens. It's about which features of a token get to communicate with which other features of another token. Okay, so it's really a feature space topography rather than a sequence level topography that we're interested in here. And I think that is very complementary to what I've heard about Connor's project in the group, which is it's more about sequence or sequence level organization. So we haven't really modeled that at all yet. Okay, so for a given token, we can visualize our feature. We can just reshape the feature vector into 2D. And so that's what this would be. And so in a standard model, this is going to be randomly organized. And what we did here to introduce topography is two things. So we have something called spatial querying. And what that is we've introduced this this M matrix here in between the queries and the keys. And what this is it's basically a local mask that constrains that basically makes it such that rather than having one query being matched with one key, we're matching a local pool of queries with one key, or vice versa. So what that says is like this key is not just being matched with this query, it's being matched with the local pool of queries, which sort of encourages that local pool of queries to represent coherently similar information, because it's pulling from all of it. And in our case, this basically ends up being like average pooling, but you can make this a learned parameter if you want to. And we've played with that a little bit since publishing the paper. There's actually a lot of variants that we can do with the general idea of building a topographic organization, which I'm happy to talk more about. But this is the basic thing that we analyze in the paper, and we call this spatial querying. The second thing is we've got this like output reweighting matrix here, WO, and what we do is just convert that to a locally connected matrix, such that we can introduce topographic organization between the values and the output of this whole equation. So this just says that this unit here gets to receive input only from this set of units rather than from the whole map. So does that roughly make sense? Any questions on this?
It does make sense. I want to ask maybe one question, I guess, to try to unpack it a little bit more. On the previous slide, you showed how the queries, the keys, and the values are resulting from applying these weights to the inputs, right?
Yeah.
And so equivalently, like all the action is happening from this M matrix being applied to the, if you can think of it as being applied to the Q, as well as the local W matrix being applied to the V. You could equivalently, since the matrix multiplication is all happening on the right, you can think of the M matrix as acting on the weights themselves.
You can definitely think of the M matrix as operating on the keys. That's definitely equivalent. I'm not sure what you mean, because this is within the softmax, so you don't fully have commutativity.
Well, if you just go back one, here. So you got like Q equals RWQ. And then the next slide you got QM. So you could just have Q equals RWQM and V equals RWVWO.
Yep. Yeah. So this is a good point, because we haven't changed these W matrices here, WQ, WK, WV. And part of the reason for that was I just had the intuition when we first were starting with this that it would be too costly to make all of these projections locally constrained throughout the whole network. And so we started with this other approach, but you can do that as well. So you can just get rid of M, get rid of the local querying thing or the spatial querying thing, and do locally connected projection matrices here. And that actually works really well as well, and it doesn't hurt performance. So that's another variant that I was kind of alluding to, which we're calling right now local querying instead of spatial querying, where just all of these projection matrices are local. And then basically you get topographic organization that's linked across all the layers too. And it's really in line with this idea of wiring cost minimization. So they seem to be, somewhat equivalent. But I think there's more work to explore the differences between those like types of models.
Cool. That makes a bunch of sense.
Yep. Thanks for the question.
I have a question too.
Yep.
That's all right. Hi.
Oh, hey, Adrian.
Nice by the way, Adrian is helping with this project also. We have meetings every once in a while.
Oh, nice. Good to see you.
You too. So just to get it straight, you're not actually enforcing any smoothness and activations or anything like that. All you're doing is saying you are not allowed to only receive from one unit. You receive from lots of units.
Yep.
That indirectly forces these ones to be consistent. That's the idea.
Exactly. It's an indirect smoothness constraint. In particular, the spatial querying, you can think of that as an indirect smoothness constraint because it's like this local averaging thing. The spatial reweighting is more like the wiring minimization idea. And the local querying that I just talked about is in line with that. But yeah, we're never explicitly enforcing smoothness, although you could do that. Like it's very easy to imagine doing like the TDAN approach to Topoformer.
You don't need it. And
what's that?
You don't need it.
No, you don't need it, which is very cool. And you can,
I wonder why.
Yeah, well, I don't think you should need it. I mean, one of the other things I should say is this is similar to the ITN work where we found that the excitatory connections helped a lot. So that really helps to encourage the local correlation by making those really just for the spatial reweighting here, making those connections positive. So that really helps as well. Yeah, when we don't make them positive, we tend to not see topography. And so, yeah, that relates to the earlier stuff with the ITNs where we kind of needed one of the sign constraints, either the separation of excitation and inhibition or the positive connections being excitatory. And that's why I really think of this as being fundamentally linked with local correlation. Like if you don't induce a local correlation somehow, it doesn't really work.
I see. Cool. Thanks.
Yep. But it can be indirect, like you said. Okay, great. So I was gonna give an example of spatial querying, but I think we got that, so I'm gonna skip that. Okay, so the first thing Taha did with this is train a one-layer model with one attention head on a sentiment analysis task. And in all of the analyses I'll present, we're using one attention head. And the reason we do that is because we reasoned that if we have more than one attention head, a lot of the functional organization could just be distributed across heads rather than within a given head. I think it still would be at this point now interesting to explore multiple heads, but we haven't done that at all. You could probably max out performance but you wouldn't get to see all the topographic organization. You'd have to create a different visualization or something. So we're restricting to one head, and that doesn't seem to be too costly. So in this simple first pass, like small scale task, sentiment analysis, we've got, movie ratings, and the task of the network is to predict whether the movie review has a positive or negative sentiment. So it's a supervised learning task. And what we found is that when we do spatial querying only, we see topographic organization within the keys and the queries, but not within the values and the attention outputs. But if we add in reweighting as well, we now see topographic organization in each of these sort of like subcomponents of the self-attention. So values and the FC out also get it now. And one of the things you can see is that this topographic organization is linked between the keys and the queries, because that's the communication that is being constrained, and similarly between the values and the FC out because of that local connectivity between them. So it seems to work. So the next thing we did was scale this up to a BERT model. Taha's also worked a little bit with GPT models, but I think the BERT one was a little bit easier to get going. So that's what we put in the paper. So it's a masked language modeling objective. Let's see, we followed this thing called the cramming procedure, which was introduced by Geiping and Goldstein, which is a nice approach for training large language models as an academic, where you have limited compute. So the idea is see how far you can get in less than one day on one GPU. So we trained for 12 hours, and I think, Taha, was this on an A100, some fancy GPU?
Yes, this was A100.
Okay, so 12 hours on an A100. Yeah. We've gone further than that. It doesn't make... You get most of the loss reduction in the first 12 hours. And then we'll compare this performance-wise first with a single head control model as well as a multi-head control model. And what you can see is that the multi-head model, here's the glue metric over here is the summary of all of these metrics. It does do a little bit better than the one head, which does a little bit better than the Topoformer, but the Topoformer is in the right ballpark. And basically it has less effective parameters than the one head model because of the local connectivity. So we were pretty pleased with this. This doesn't seem like a major performance deficit. It seems to be in the right ballpark of performing well in the task. And we could try other things to get the performance even better. But importantly, we're not trying to argue that this is something which is going to boost performance. Not yet anyway. This is really about interpretability and biological plausibility rather than a performance thing. Okay. So we analyzed topographic organization in the final layer here, and I'm going to show you the keys and the FC out. What we did is do PCA over the responses, and we're using the sentences from the fMRI experiment. And you can see nice topographic organization of these different components. The keys and the queries ended up having this kind of cool local patchy organization. The FC out and the values were a little bit less topographically organized, and it was a bit more global. We quantified that here. So we used the same statistic that I used earlier in the brain data to quantify this topography, make sure it's significant. We definitely found that the values had the least topographic organization, and FC out was also weaker. The organization in the queries and keys was quite strong over local distances, and that makes sense because you can see it's got this very locally patchy structure. And yeah, just overall, each of them had significantly greater than chance topographic organization. We're not quite sure why the values didn't come out as topographically organized, but we didn't really have enough compute to fully do every hyperparameter sweep. I think we can play with this more and probably get better results with the values. So yeah, it's kind of a proof of concept here that this works. So we wanted to try to interpret the organization within the model, because we can run as many experiments on that as we want. We're not constrained by fMRI data collection. So Greta and Taha really came up with these contrasts here, which are, I think, inspired from or taken partially from the syntax gym. And then we did some other stuff with it. So we've got some semantic contrasts, and we've got some minimal pair syntax contrasts. So for example, a semantic contrast would be something like animacy, where we're comparing animate and inanimate content. So a sentence about animate things or a sentence about inanimate things, these sentences are not matched really, in any serious way. So there's a lot of variance across the sentences, but within the condition, the content is the same, or the category of the content is the same. We can also look at intactness, which is taking a sentence and then shuffling all the words around. We can look at things like concreteness, visuomotor, acceptability. So they're these minimal pair syntax contrasts where in these conditions, everything is the same except for one word. And that one word makes a meaningful difference to the content of the sentence. So we can make a sentence unacceptable by taking a sunflower has yellow petals and turning that into a peanut has yellow petals. We now know that that's not something that is true. It's not acceptable, and so on. So I can explain these in more detail if that's of interest, or I can kind of just show you the results. So let me know if you want me to go into more detail on this. Anyone, just say so. Okay, well, we can get back to it if people are interested. So here's what it looks like. We do these contrasts, basically just like an fMRI contrast, where we take the responses to one condition and subtract out the responses to the other condition using a t-test. And what we found is that the intactness and semantic contrasts gave us much greater selectivity than some of these minimal pair syntax contrasts. So we found really strong topographic selectivity for intactness, animacy, concreteness, a little bit less so for visuomotor. And we were able to decode each of these conditions pretty well from the distributed pattern of activations, in contrast with these other ones where we didn't really see much topography. And notably, like this color bar is on a much more restricted range than this one. So it's even weaker than it might look at first glance. And we couldn't really decode these properties either. So yeah, there's this distributed representation of these different properties, and some of them are represented and some of them aren't. So yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, so before you had similar maps, but it was PCA on across like some test set, and here it's different. It's just like contrast between, let's say, animate and inanimate sentences.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Just to make sure.
Yeah,
Thanks.
so two different views on the same information. One is like hypothesis driven, which is this one. We have these hypotheses about what might be represented. And the PCA is a hypothesis neutral visualization of the organization. Just what are the dominant modes of variability?
Yeah, cool.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay, great.
This might be one more, sorry.
Very good.
This might be a dumb question, but if you were to do this on the model with no topography, what would happen? Would everything just look
Doesn't look like this. We have a figure in the supplementary where, I mean, it's the same case of the decoding accuracy and the like absolute values of the selectivity are similar, but everything is just randomly organized. So it's all just like, it just looks like Gaussian noise with like a different mean across the conditions.
Do you still get some dimensions that are selective, but they're just scattered, or
exactly?
Really
yeah. So okay. We don't have a strong. We're not making a strong case that the dimensions are changing. It's just that the dimensions are being organized topographically now. Got it. There might be some ways in which the dimensions do change, and I think you can look at like the recent TDAN like neuron paper from Dan Yeamans' group, where they're arguing that there's like there's a difference in the dimensions a little bit. Like when you have topographic constraints, that local correlation gives a different different dimensions that when you predict units 1-to-1 between the model and the brain, you actually do a little bit better when you have a topographic model. So it's an interesting finding, and I think we could pursue that further with this, but that's not the argument we're trying to make right here. It's more just that the representations have this topographic organization, which makes it a bit easier to see what's going on and easier to predict. Cool. Okay, so the last thing I'll do is try to show you that we can actually use these models to as a comparison tool with the topographic representations in the language network. So I showed you kind of like the principal components of each of these systems. One way that we can make sure that the components are related is we can do something called cross decomposition with the technique called PLS-SVD. So what this does is instead of decomposing the X and Y matrices independently, we can decompose their cross covariance. And this gives us shared components that basically align between the X matrix, which maybe is our brain data, and the Y matrix, which is our model data. And then we can measure the alignment with held out data and visualize, again, the component topography with the weights. So this is what that looks like in terms of math. We've got this X matrix, the brain responses. We do a matrix multiplication with the model embedding. So this is our cross covariance matrix. And then we just do an SVD on that. And what we end up getting is that the U matrix here is the brain loadings, and the V matrix here is the model loadings. And then we can compute the scores like this on held out data and check whether those components are aligned. And importantly, like if the representations are not related in the brain and the model, this alignment would be good on the training data. Like it would be reasonable on the training data because the technique would be able to find some shared variance in the noise, but it wouldn't generalize to held out data because it wouldn't be picking up on any like real property. Whereas if the information is like can be aligned in terms of functional properties like of the sentences, you should get good alignment on held out data. So that's how we measure the alignment of these components after we fit this PLS SVD. Okay, so here's what we get. So on the top here, I'm showing the components for a given, like for the Topoformer layer 15, the keys. You can see these are the weights onto the 0th, 1st, and 2nd dimension. And correspondingly down on the bottom here are the weights from the language network of a given subject when we do this cross decomposition. You can see that both of them have this cool topographic organization to them. And the first two components seem to be aligned when we measure their responses to held out data. In contrast, this third component, which looks topographically organized, seems to not be mapping some meaningful property that's shared across the model in the brain. And this is an example of a component which is not aligned. We do not see a correlation in the held out data. So we can scale this up to all subjects and all different like sublayers, the keys, queries, values, FC out. And so that's what this looks like here. So this is the mean and standard deviation across subjects. And you can see we get above chance alignment of the first couple components, and then it tends to be less likely to align for the later components. So we're able to align the low dimensional variability, and we can see that these components are topographically organized in both the brain and the model. We did some control analyses to make sure that this is interesting. So we looked at untrained models. And actually, this is something which I think is kind of gaining steam in the NLP brain modeling literature. But turns out that untrained models actually provide a pretty good fit to neural data. But we did find that if we look at the first component, that's true. So the untrained model does just as well in predicting, in aligning with the neural data as a trained model, but the second component is much better for the trained model. And in all cases, we get better alignment with the language network than with a control network of brain areas that are not involved in language in particular. So this alignment is kind of specific to the language network and is higher in trained models than untrained models.
Can I ask how you interpret what this means about the role of component what?
The role of what?
Component one, which is sort of dealt with properly by an untrained model. What kind of thing is it doing?
I don't know yet. So I think this is a mystery that the field needs to figure out, which is why are untrained models so good at predicting brain responses in the language network. There's one thing is the tokenizer is still trained. And two, there's like an aggregation happening across all of the information. So I think it would be interesting to try like a random tokenizer and see whether that gets rid of this result. I don't think anyone's looked at that yet, but it's really a puzzle. I can say there will be a CCN paper on this. I know because I reviewed it. I can't tell you anything about it, but there is a CCN paper that is looking at this issue, and it's pretty interesting. So look out for that. And I think this is just a really cool problem that the field needs to think more about. Like, why are untrained models so good at predicting brain variance? But we do see like the trained model does have this much better alignment of the second component. And yeah, it's a good question. I haven't really thought specifically about, what it means for this first component. It could be something about the tokenization or just general aggregation, but definitely a good question. Thanks.
Thanks.
And just to add a little bit more to the point, a great explanation, Nick, but in terms of tokenization, the intuition here is that, byte pair encoding will like have different number of tokens depending on how frequent or how surprising the input is. And like one of the most robust findings from linguist neuroscience is that these regions are so sensitive to frequency and surprisal effects. So if you have a tokenizer that already has a ton of information about the frequency, meaning the surprisal of the input, then you can actually go pretty far or like get at least a chunk of variance explained already. And as Nick mentioned, there is work coming out in that vein.
Yeah, that was a great explanation, Greta. Thanks. I hadn't thought of it that way.
I'll be looking forward then. Thanks.
Great. Okay, I think that about wraps up the results. So I'll just briefly summarize, and then we can get into a more of a chat about some related ideas. So the language network seems to exhibit weak but substantial local correlation and topographically organized components of variability. These topographic transformer models can be trained to develop similar forms of topographic organization with just a couple of simple modifications that don't affect performance very much. And these components, I didn't really show you a lot of this, but they appear to be polysemantic, and they really require further interpretability work. And I think this might be a difference compared with vision, where the early dimensions are a little bit more easily interpreted. So there's definitely a lot of good work to be done there. There's one last section, sorry. So one thing that's cool about the transformer is it's domain agnostic. Anything that you can turn into a sequence, we can use basically the same architecture for. You just have to figure out how to turn it into a sequence. So the Topoformer is then now a domain agnostic architecture for topographic modeling. So we can look at vision, we can look at audition, olfaction, decision-making. Like there's anything you can do with the transformer, you can now try to model the topographic organization of with the Topoformer model, which I think is really exciting. So being a vision scientist, I wanted to try this out with a VIT model, so a vision transformer. And the way this works is basically just a regular transformer, but we take the image and we convert it into a sequence of patches. So you break this image down, it's many patches, and then that gives you the sequence. You have some positional embeddings in the model, so it knows about the X and Y positions of the patches. So we just did some preliminary analyses here, training an 8-layer Topoformer on ImageNet. We used 112 dimensional images, patches of 8 by 8. And then I compared the responses to the human ventral temporal cortex using the natural scenes dataset. And what we found here is that the organization is actually interpretable because this is a vision model, and the vision components seem to just be more interpretable. So we found this, we looked at layer 6 and one subject here, and we found that this early components derived with PLS SVD again, it really maps nicely onto animacy. So we quantified the animacy label of like every image, and we found that the activation of this component was highly correlated with whether an image contained animate content, and other components were not correlated with that. So we really got most of the animacy variance in that first component, which I think is pretty cool. And it suggests that, whatever difficulty we're having interpreting the language components, it's not about the architecture per se, it's about probably the representations. And so depending on what the representations are that serve a task, you might get more or less interpretable topography. So yep, these transformer models can provide some concrete insights into cortical organization of broad capabilities. And lastly, I just want to highlight that Taha has put a lot of effort in to make this code public. It's now available. And so you should go check it out and try it and let us know if you have any issues. And yeah, just thanks again to Taha and Greta for all the awesome efforts. It was just, like the most fun project I've gotten to work on, and it's been great. And I'm looking forward to further developments of it in the future. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if anyone has questions,
Nick.
feel free
That's
to
great.
add them and put them in the chat if you don't want to talk out loud.
Yes, Alex, I can. So that was how do we do that? Yeah, so the images in NSD are all COCO images, and that comes with that comes with a bunch of like bounding boxes with category labels. And so what we did is we said it's animate if it contains any categories that are animate. So like animate images also contain inanimate things, but inanimate images don't contain any animate things. If that makes sense. If you compare the topographic organization of Topoformers to the topographic organization in brains, yeah, I mean, I tried to do that with the cross decomposition thing. We're not right now trying to make like strong claims about the particular size of any of the regions, or it's not a one-to-one mapping. It's sort of just an illustration of some of the principles. But these models are very different from the brain in several ways, like that Connor is working on, like trying to make it not 15 layers or 20 layers, like trying to make more reasonable communication between tokens, stuff like that. So we're not yet trying to do a one-to-one modeling of the brain.
I'll ask a question with my voice. So I'm not sure I understood. So your model has just one layer, and that's it?
No, this model has 16 layers, the BERT model does. We just showed you, as far as visualizations are concerned, I just showed you oops. We don't need the keyboard. I just showed you in terms of visualizations, like the last layer here, but here we quantified organization across all the layers. So you see topography in every layer. And we didn't have space. This was a conference paper, so we didn't have space to really analyze like differences across layers, but that would be an interesting thing to do, to try to quantify what is the difference in topographic organization from like an early, mid, and late layer of the model.
Yeah, exactly. And what that maps onto in the brain.
Totally.
Like I don't know too much about language, but in vision you have these hallmarks of topography in the early visual areas and so on, and then there's a transition and it looks different at different points along the visual stream, and I'm sure it's the same in language to some extent. I'm interested to know if you'd get the sort of hierarchical map between the model and the...
I would love to look more at that. Thanks.
Cool, thanks. I have to run, but thank you. Thanks
yeah,
for the
good
talk.
to see you, Adrian. Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, Adrian.
So I have a question. So broadly speaking, I guess the initial motivation here is you wanted to better understand the language organization of the brain. But the conclusion is basically it's not clean. Like there isn't a way to cleanly figure out like topics that are spatially constrained, like vision seems to be. So like is the sort of takeaway message here that like we've learned that language processing is topographic in a way that is not cleanly interpretable and like polysemantic, or like how do you think you can actually maybe extract more interpretable findings out of this?
Yeah, I think that's strongly suggested by the work. It's not conclusively shown, but like I alluded to earlier, like I think now that we've got these topographic model, like transformer models, they seem to have some of the same like properties as the language system, even though it's not a one-to-one map. I think we can really try to probe the topography in these models more. Like if we can extract monosemantic features with a sparse autoencoder from one of these layers of the topoformer, then let's visualize like what does that feature look like in its representation. We visualize the weights of that feature onto the layer, and we can see, is that a local thing? Is it distributed? Like, is it a local little patch that's just interspersed with lots of other local patches? I think that'll be really exciting. And I don't know how much data you need to fit those sparse autoencoders well. I think it's probably a lot. So I think it's not really possible to do that same analysis for the brain yet, but I think it would be very suggestive to, if we can have these models that seem to be similar to the brain in many ways, and then we can run some of these analyses on the model, I think that will give us some good hypotheses that might be tested more in a more targeted way with the brain data. We just need way more brain data for language. Greta's data set is like an amazing starting point, but it's still only 1,000 short sentences. And there's still, the data of people like reading sentences is not perfect, because as soon as they stop reading the sentence, they're thinking about something else. And that is language. And so it's really hard to get like super reliable estimates. So even if you look at the noise ceiling and quantify the component similarity across pairs of subjects, we actually get better alignment of the model in a subject than we see between two subjects, because there's a lot of noise in the data. So understanding the language network, I think, is hard. I think we're hoping to suggest that this is a way of looking at the language network that hasn't been done much before, and it could be fruitful. And you might want to consider, like these components of representation. You might want to localize like a component rather than an anatomical region. You could say, this is the component, and we're going to weight some other set of responses according to that component weighting, and see how that does in like, new tasks. So you could think of this as the localizer experiment, and then another task as your analysis experiment, and see whether, that component really predicts responses to totally different types of information. But yeah, I think it's kind of up to others to see how to move forward with this. It's not super like clear what is this organization, and I think we'll need to do more work to figure it out.
Yeah. Interesting. And another reason why we need to collect even more data sets for these kind of things.
Yeah.
Follow-up is, so vision is more interpretable in terms of these features comparing with models. Why is that? Is it like do you think it's because of the like retinotopic processing initially, or?
That's a good question. I don't think that the high level features are because of retinotopy. I think they're like where they end up in the brain has to do with retinotopy, but that's sort of a different point. I don't know why the features are more interpretable. I mean, it's vision may be simpler than language in a way. And like, yeah, it may just be that the properties that represent animate things like don't need to communicate as strongly with the properties that, with the features that represent inanimate things. For example, it's like it's more distinct subspaces of processing. And so they can kind of be segregated a little bit more easily, whereas with language, like all content kind of needs to be, refer to other types of content. So it's quite speculative. But I think this is really a question of representation rather than of topographic organization, and the topography gives you some insights into like what are those representational questions that need to be asked, but ultimately then that question is just one of representation.
Yeah, I agree. And another point to add to that is that language is, by the merit of being language, also just further removed from the stimulus properties. It doesn't depend on like the characters that you read or the like speech waveform that you hear. While in the case of vision with animate things, like the lower level properties are just more similar within animate things and non-animate things. And that correspondence just does not really hold for language, making this even more tricky.
That's a great point. Yeah, because like even when we say something is like animate, there are mid-level features that can predict that without giving you semantic content. So yeah, there are these just like correlations of semantic content in vision that track earlier statistics, probably more so than with language.
I think that's super interesting. I was thinking about the same question. Thinking just about the high level, though, you still see pretty striking organization of high level visual cortex that seems to be interpretable, compared to language, which is maybe all high level, pretty removed from the stimulus properties, being less interpretable. I wonder, like, could there be some basic principle argument that says, like, based on like the distribution of concepts that we talk about versus the distribution of concepts that we visually interact with, like maybe the visual distribution is much like softer tail compared to the language distribution being much longer, heavier tail. Like maybe we just talk about a much richer diversity of things than we visually interact with, which requires compressing much more information into fewer features in the language case. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm just basically trying to think about at the high level, why would you expect language to require more polysemantic representation compared to vision, at least on the face?
Yeah, I mean, I think like vision, I don't want to give the impression that vision models don't also have this issue of polysemanticity. It's just that the low level dimensions are interpretable, but other than that, it's still extremely hard to interpret vision models. You know, there's whole like research, like we've got a researcher who just did his PhD in my lab here, whose whole PhD was like on trying to interpret feature tuning in vision models. And it's not easy, you know, and you can only interpret some of the units and not others. And some of them have like a really clean interpretation, but not all of them. So I think this is a general thing that emerges within neural networks. And it's more a difference in terms of like the dominant modes of variability being interpretable rather than that interpretability is easy in one type of model and not in the other. It's always going to be like a gradation. And I think all of these models have a degree of polysemanticity.
Cool. Okay, I want to raise the question that I had from the beginning that you also hinted at, which is at the high level in terms of building models that are topographic, you have these different ways of doing it. You have feature level topography, which is what you guys are doing here. You have maybe sequence level topography, which is what we're trying to do in the topographic mixture of experts stuff. And you also have kind of jointly both, which I think the TDAN and the all-TNN from the Keesman lab are sort of examples of, where, you know, in the TDAN, they take the convolutional feature tensors and then flatten them and map everything onto a large map. So that's kind of jointly, you have a sequence and a channel dimension in there. So yeah, I think you have these three options: feature level topography, sequence level topography, or both. And examples of each of them, like which do you think best captures the sort of topography you see in the brain?
Definitely, I mean, definitely the all TNN approach, like the idea of just having local connectivity everywhere, and that giving rise to both, like in terms of vision, topography with respect to space and topography with respect to features. That is the right way of thinking about it. It's just a question of implementing it. Those locally connected models don't learn very well. It's hard to train them to do the task nearly as well. So you don't end up learning representations that are as good. You don't end up learning as high level of representations because those models just struggle from like from a sample efficiency point of view. So it's like those models just, if you look at the topography in them, it's not nearly as good. Like the all-TNN is it's the right idea. I don't think like their implementation of local smoothness is the best. I would rather it be in terms of local connectivity, but that's a different story. But the topography just is not as clean as in convolutional networks where you can learn better features. With the TDAN, it's kind of a cheat because it's still a CNN and you're allowing the units to be moved around like according to the local smoothness, but those features are still all subject to convolution. So there's a lot of like hacks that had to go into that to make it work well, but it's still beautiful what you can get out of it. So right now, I think there's questions of theory, like what is the best like idea of what causes topography in the brain, and there's questions of implementation which are limited by our ability to train different models. And you know, in the end, we want to have something which considers, you know, all forms of topography as basically one and the same. But with transformers, like you're limited, obviously, because sequence is fundamentally different from features in these models. You can't combine them because you always have to have a sequence. So you can do both, but they're never going to be like unified in the same way.
I think you do always have to have a sequence, but the sequence doesn't necessarily need to be the input sequence.
Yeah.
You can map the input sequence to your latent sequence, and they can be that mapping doesn't have to be a one-to-one.
Yeah, so
or at least that's how I think about it.
we're excited, that there are now like some sequence models, like some state space models and XLSTMs and these sorts of things that are now able to do language really well. Because I think like a recurrent neural network is a better starting point than a transformer for a model of the brain. But again, it's a question of implementation, like whether one learns good representations. And until recently, it was hard to get these, models with a continuously evolving state to work well. So I think that's a really exciting future direction for language modeling, because then the sequence just falls out naturally as being something about memory. And within language, that's all it really is. Within vision, the idea of a sequence is contrived for a transformer. It's not really a sequence, it's space. So it all comes in at once. So you have to think about how that space interacts with things. And in that case, I think, yeah, like just a locally connected network makes the most sense there. And of course, it should be recurrent too, but just the local connectivity should give rise to the topography. So, if we can figure out how to train locally connected networks better, I think that, the all TNN approach is the way we want to go eventually.
I push back on that a tiny bit because I maybe you'll convince me, but I haven't been thinking of the all TNN as the ideal case, even though I do really like it, because they think of units as being laid out on a 2x2, on a 2D grid, but the grid has 0 thickness. You have each unit at every position is laid out on the grid, but the brain, the cortex has thickness. It has 2 millimeters of thickness, and there's like 4,000 neurons in the thickness column. So I want some thickness also.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's definitely missing from all of these models. I mean, I think the ITN sort of gets at this a little bit. We had this idea of a simple cortical column of E and I units. It's a really like just a first pass like idea of this, but we showed like by having two overlapping grids of units, those units learn similar feature tuning. So you get the emergence of cortical columns because of the local connectivity constraints, which apply across those layers too. But yeah, I would love to see more stuff like considering the thickness of the cortical sheet, like thinking more about cell types. What I meant that the all TNN approach is the way we want to go eventually is just in the sense that we don't have convolution and we don't have like transformers have weight sharing as well. People like to say that transformers don't have weight sharing, but they've got weight sharing across tokens. Like it's the same set of features that are being picked up on every set of tokens. So I don't really understand that. Like it's still weight sharing.
I know they have massive weight sharing.
Yeah. So yeah, like I think something without weight sharing is where we want to go. That's what I meant. Like that the brain doesn't have weight sharing. The brain maybe has some sort of mechanisms for encouraging similar weights across space. Like there are these horizontal connections like between similarly tuned populations representing like fovea and like near fovea, but it's an open question whether that does anything similar to weight sharing.
Yeah, I fully agree with the no weight sharing point.
Yeah,
that's kind of where the overlap between like my interest and the Keysman lab, Adrian Sejin Liu is also here. I was like, I also don't like weight sharing, and then we got on the same team. No, it's super interesting.
Good stuff. So what do we got for time here? It's 11:15. How long are we going till?
However long we want, we can wrap up.
No, I'm happy to keep chatting more. I mean, I'd love to chat more with you guys about your model. Maybe I could join for one of your other meetings like another time, and we could because I feel like it'll take a while to go through those results. But maybe we could just plan for that and see whether there's a way to combine these types of ideas. Because I think that, the Topoformer still lacks a lot of biological realism, that it would be cool to think about, do we need all this stuff? Do we need 16 layers? Can we have something more like a one-to-one model of the language network rather than, each of these layers being like a representational model?
Yeah, I totally agree. It is kind of, you get the topography in each individual layer, but putting the whole piece together, I feel like you lose a little bit of the mapping to the larger.
we can
structure.
constrain the connections between layers as well. And you can think about like putting the layers next to each other, and then that's the distance constraint now, is like this layer has to go over here. So it's sort of then we'll be pressured to put stuff towards the edge of that layer. So you can think about like creating a interesting topology of how the different layers are hooked up to each other, rather than just imagining they're on top of each other. And then
Exactly. Yeah.
and then you can start eventually, maybe within the next 10 years, I think we could actually have a reasonable like model that is embedded, like that is a one-to-one embedded like cortical sheet. I think it's going to take a lot of work before that's reasonable, but that's where we want to go with this type of stuff, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I want. That's what I would like to see. Probably 10 years, I don't know. But yeah, rather than have a stack of layers, one sheet with some kind of geometry that describes the space and defines what wiring distance is, and constraining the communication to be local, and somehow getting the topographic learning to work well without a lot of weight sharing. Yeah, I think it'll be great.
Yeah, and the thing, like, it's really interesting with the language network and certain other like of these distributed networks, frontoparietal attention network and stuff, like they have this local aspect, but then they have this really like strong long range connectivity too. It's like there's really strong connections between frontal language and temporal language, and that's not local at all. But it's like it's a choice that the wiring diagram had to make. Like the long range wiring diagram is sparse. It's not necessarily local, but it has to make sparsity choices and then project locally with the connections that it has. So it's the same general idea of like wiring constraints, but it's like local connectivity is not the only way to maximize task performance while minimizing wiring constraints. You're going to need some long range connections too. And thinking about how does biology like solve that problem with combination of learning rules and like innate wiring diagrams is a pretty interesting open question too.
Yeah, totally
and
fascinating.
Actually, now when we're talking about it, we have this project in our lab that we call the Interesting Brains Project, which is very ongoing. It's this project where individuals that have had early lesions, maybe they didn't know they had like some kind of lesion in their brain or some abnormality, then we scan them, and then we basically ask, or not we, I'm not a part of this project, I don't know. They ask like, where does the language network and other like big cognitive networks end up, and what are the constraints on, for instance, like connectivity that you still need to wire up like these chunks of language. I guess whenever that is out, that would actually like be a good descriptor for at least getting an intuition of what kinds of connections you want to build into this type of like sheet or model. Yeah, I hadn't thought much about this link before. It just like popped into my brain, but noted.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the minimum, like it would be cool to think about just having like a 4-layer transformer, posterior temporal, anterior temporal, inferior frontal, like, middle frontal or whatever. And just thinking about strong connections between all of those. It's maybe not hierarchical. And just see what kind of emerges in terms of the patterns of activation across those areas. Each of them is topographically constrained, and then they have strong interconnectivity as well. That'd be really neat.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Yeah, and you're invited to join us. We actually meet Fridays at this time if you ever want to chat more about the specifics of this work. One more question in the chat that I want to throw out. Does 3D modeling of the neuralitic structure of the speech part of the brain affect your research?
Sorry, what does neuralitic mean?
I don't know.
Does this person wanna unmute potentially? Okay, well maybe not, but not right now. I don't exactly know what this question means, but we're not really modeling speech closely here. But again, like I think that I'm just trying to get people excited about this type of work because it would be cool to see people try to model speech processing. In particular, like the audio side of it is a little bit more straightforward. Speech production, although that it seems like AI speech production models are pretty good now. I saw the OpenAI demo recently, and it's pretty impressive. So, let's see, neurolysis. Temporary degeneration. Yeah, I'm not sure how that relates exactly. But I think of this type of work as being at somewhat of an intermediate level of like biological plausibility. It's like you're taking into account some of the key constraints like wiring constraints and maybe like sign-based constraints of like excitation and inhibition, but you're not really modeling all of the biology like super seriously, because if you were to do that, you wouldn't be able to train the models. Like you'd just run into lots of constraints in being able to train these things. So it's sort of a matter of picking which biological details you think are relevant for certain like outcomes. And that's part of like, what it means to be a computational modeler is trying to figure out which details matter and which details don't. And of course, there's always going to be other details that probably matter that you haven't considered. And it's up to you or the next person to demonstrate that. So right now we're not working with spiking networks. That would be very cool. Spiking networks, again, are very hard to train because they're not differentiable. So there's like, there's tricks that people do, I think, to convert rate trained models into spiking networks. But I'm not exactly sure what spiking gets you with respect to these questions. And it's really difficult, so we haven't done it. But I think obviously like spiking is the way the brain does it. So there's something there, but we're not incorporating it yet.
Yeah, there's definitely a middle ground here of like how deep do you really want to go into the hard neuro of replicating things in neural networks, and like if you go too deep, it might not even be like getting you what you want. You might want like the higher level interpretability of things, which doesn't require all of the nuances of that. You know, also
Yeah,
I
I
could
totally
see
agree.
like I know it was mentioned before of like this is to better understand, I guess, like the topography of the brain, right? Like better understanding the interpretability of the brain. But like I do think AI people without any interest in neuro would also be interested in this, right? Like there's potential to have interpretable neural networks that now the companies are getting more interested in, right? Like Anthropic and OpenAI just put out these blog posts about sparse autoencoders, et cetera. Like if you can get for free, like not really reducing performance much, but now interpretable transformers, like I feel like AI in general would be very interested in this.
Yeah, I mean, we have this dream of like, getting in contact with someone at Anthropic or OpenAI or maybe Stability and having them just let us train these models for a really long time so that we can have a really performant one. Yeah, so I think maybe we'll be able to do that soon. And but I think even the models trained on less data, like they still get you part of the way there. But yeah, it would be really exciting to see these things trained at full scale and then to apply these same interpretability techniques to them. Yeah, we're super excited about that too.
Yeah. If you think about it, we kind of got lucky with the brain being as organized as it is. Like there even is any kind of spatial topographic structure is a lucky break, and the current LLMs vision models don't have this at all. Everything's completely scrambled.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
being able to watch the high resolution activation maps of your model would be pretty cool.
Totally. Yeah, you can really just like it's much easier to do quick intuitive visualizations, see how stuff unfolds across tokens, see how stuff varies across different properties. Like you don't have to yeah, you don't have to like plot every unit separately. You just do it on a grid. And then you can see all those relationships across units, like, and you can use your spatial prior, like that, like the local units are communicating more with each other as a way of interpreting like what's going on more, like, interpreting the topology of the network through that prior. So yeah, I think I don't think we've convincingly demonstrated like really strong improvements in interpretability yet, but it's really early. And I think that people should push more on it.
Also, those visualizations are probably very beautiful and good for marketing material.
Yeah, that's one thing about topographic modeling is it's always just looks cool and people like it for that. Yeah. So Paul, how is it running a lab at Stability? Like how long has that been going on for?
Oh, that's been going on like nearly a year, I guess, at this point. It's kind of interesting because it's not a normal lab, right? Like technically speaking, the lab is volunteers, like, Connor and others who are very knowledgeable, oftentimes we're collaborating with universities, like grad students, postdocs, PIs, and it's all just collaborative open work, which is kind of unique. At the same time, stability is not trying to like support a whole NeuroAI team. So I try to get them to expand on the scope of things and hire people, but they're not that willing to invest too much into the
Right.
NeuroAI side of
They're like, we'll
things.
hire you, and then you have to convince people that this stuff is cool and have them help out. I mean, but that's the thing is like, I feel like with these open projects, it really gives people from a less privileged background a chance to shine. And that's what Taha did with this project. Like, he was also volunteering his time on this project and was able to just like do a ton of really cool stuff with it. So I hope that you guys will have that experience with many people. I'm sure you are having that same experience, like just at a much greater scale.
Yeah, I think that shows the potential. Like with Neuromatch, you're basically able to find people who are likewise interested in working on similar things. You're not so flustered to your small lab at your university. You can like really kind of branch out and work with larger groups. And so far, it seems like that leads to like really cool work, like stability at least can give us the compute, for instance, to train the bigger models, right? But the real potential, I think, is yeah, finding a way to get together with other people to publish together, show the potential of new ideas.
Yeah. So I'm curious, like how many like A100s do you have access to, or H100s? Are you guys in the 50,000 range? Like,
I'm not allowed to talk about how much compute stability.
That's fair. Cool.
All right. So I guess we can wrap up. And or would you be interested in attending maybe a meeting of ours to go
Sure.
in more in depth?
Would love to, yeah.
That'd be great. Yeah, maybe Connor, we can send an email after this to give you the details. But
Yeah, and I'm in the Discord. I haven't really looked in it much, but we can chat there too.
great.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think for that point, maybe like in 2 weeks or so, we can devote the meeting to me just giving like a talk that recaps where we're at, and for people that haven't joined in a little while. I think it'd be useful for people that have joined just to remember what we're doing this for, and also you can get an overview rather than have to join our meeting and catch up on the fly.
Great. Yeah, that sounds awesome. Thanks again, guys.